Welcome to a special series of programs on the future of humanism. I'm Bill Weir, the producer of this video that takes you to the conference on the future of humanism at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis in October 2016, where we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the beginning of congregational humanism, the humanism that was led by Reverend John Dietrich at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis for many decades. But now it's time to hear new voices for humanism.
So to follow up both on what Sunita said and what Phil said, even within self-identified humanist traditions, are there people whose work we're leaving out when we say we haven't done this as humanists? Are there people we should be, this is something that comes up every time somebody writes another article that says, there are no women in atheism. Hi! Are there people that we should be, even as we're being critical, making sure we don't lose their work and don't let that fall to history the way a lot of marginalized people do? And this one is open to anybody who'd like to address it.
Well, there's a great book called Village Atheist that just came out. I'm reading it right now, and I'm learning about all kinds of free thinkers, male, female. So far, they're all white, but I'm only about 1/3 of the book in. But there's a rich history, to be sure. Ernestine, off the top of my head, for women, I would think of Ernestine Rose, Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger. I'm trying to think who else. Anybody other names that people would like?
Sure, I did a search engine inquiry, and it took 0.04 seconds, and there were close to 1 million results for humanists. And so it depends on the range that you're looking for, whether you're looking within your own country or whether you're looking by nationality, whether you're looking across the world, especially people who haven't claimed the labels themselves. So in Brazil, there's Maria Berenice Diaz. In Australia, there's Helen Caldicott. There are so many humanists that the Humanist Association has awarded Humanist of the Year, from Sakharov to Sagan, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem. So it's not hard.
Phil raises a good question, and it's a difficult one. It seems to me, in part, it requires a conversation concerning the intent behind the question, right? So on some level, we grab all of these folks because we want to constitute something that resembles community, right? That we are not alone, so we just gobble these folks up. I tend to be much more comfortable thinking about some of these figures as being humanism aligned as opposed to being humanist, right? So it seems to me, W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, there's every reason to believe he was an agnostic, right? That his religiosity, read theism, is rather shaky even before he leaves for Germany. But once he hits Germany, it's on, right? He comes back a very different person. And so there are ways in which he talks, his conversation concerning religion is rather pragmatic, and it kind of speaks to an agnosticism, but does that make him a humanist? Humanism aligned, perhaps, but a humanist. In the same way that when I critique black churches, I'm critiquing folks who self-align with that institution as opposed to the millions of African Americans who say maybe there's something out there. And I go to church with my mother on Mother's Day, and I go on Christmas, and I go on Easter, right? When I hold that institution accountable, I'm talking about the people who self-identify. And so for me, when I talk about humanism falling short, I want to, and a privilege in that conversation, and put some parameters around that, can privilege within that conversation people who self-identify, right? Because then I can argue what you claim and what you do, that stuff doesn't line up.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah, and I think we have to be careful about claiming or over-claiming people for humanism or for this sort of humanist tradition, because it can be an opportunity to give ourselves an out from having to critically reflect on why our institutions have failed in certain ways. If we can say, well, these people were also humanists and they expand what humanism has done, it gives us an opportunity to not have to strive to do better. And it also makes it so that we don't have to ask the question, why are there people that we see who, from our vantage point, look like they are operating in ways that we would consider humanistic, and yet they're not claiming that label. If we can find a way to sort of bring them into what we're doing, rather than having to push ourselves to step out to where they are, then we don't have the opportunity to self-reflect critically in that way. I think that the question of who are people that are doing this work who, we should be sure to lift up. I mean, I've had the incredible opportunity over the last 5, 6, 7 years of my life to get to travel to many different parts of the United States and the country, and have conversations with people around the book that I wrote and the work that I've been doing. And the richest part of that experience for me has been to meet people who are on the ground in their communities doing the work of building and lifting up communities. And they're people whose names no one, 20, 25 miles away has ever heard. And they're the folks whose perspectives are, I think, vital to this conversation. And unfortunately, none of those folks are on stage with us right now. And part of it is because they're doing the work on the ground that so often keeps them so busy and that occupies so much of their time that they aren't able to put themselves out there in a way that would get them to be asked to be on this stage. So that's something that I have tried to reflect on a lot and try to continue to reflect on a lot. Even now, when I am invited to do something like this and I accept the invitation, and I'm very grateful to be here today. Please don't take these comments as lack of gratitude. But I often stop and ask myself, whose space am I taking? Who could contribute to this conversation, who's not, because I'm here? And do I necessarily really have something to offer to this conversation? Or am I reiterating perspectives that are already being heard? And I think that those are hard questions to ask. Certainly they are hard questions for me. And I don't know that I necessarily always do as good of a job of living out how I would, the responses to those questions that I would want to. But I think it's worth reflecting on as we think about this question.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like this is not on, but I guess people can hear me. I would add a footnote to what's been said. I mean, for me, there is an intellectual, conceptual, reflective, recursive aspect to being a humanist. It's not simply a matter of a set of practical commitments. Humanists don't have a monopoly on those beautiful practical commitments that we just described. Right. There are all kinds of people, many who are theists, who are just as committed to those ethical components of humanism as we are. So we can't misuse the term humanism in the way that many people misuse the word religion and sort of recruit, people to their cause. I think the practical commitments are important, but the conceptual, intellectual, and reflective components of humanism are just as important.
Couple of things. One is the urgency and the other is respect. So urgency is about our moment in time today and the urgency or need to claim labels. Also our urgency as in feminism, as in humanism, to recruit for ourselves a body of people whom we can say stand behind us or stand with us, right? So think about this question about what is the need to claim socialism, atheism, feminism, humanism at this point in time. And so that would put some parameters on what we're trying to do. The other is self-identification. I think that's very important that we respect people who identify themselves as such. But the other side of it is that urgency that we want to bring within our communities people who haven't identified themselves. So Virginia Woolf never said she was a feminist, but she's the basis of all feminist syllabi and discussions, right? So how do we go about clarifying and respecting our self-identifications? And I feel your point deeply. I think taking up the space of people who may be here to do the work as well, I think part of that is advocacy and representation. So that's how I rationalize my place here, that I'm doing the work or bringing the word from other people and serving as a conduit rather than as an entity in and of itself, right?
Thanks, everybody. I guess I want to just keep throwing things out that are maybe a little bit pushing things. I guess when I really was thinking about this question leading up to this event, I was really struggling with something. So maybe you don't, and maybe you have different. I'm curious if it's different for you. To me, one of the things I really never liked about religion was I didn't like people telling me I ought to whatever. You ought to read this. You ought to believe this. You ought to come here on Sunday. You ought to get involved in this. Like that. Maybe that's not the case for you all, but I really didn't like that aspect of religion. Like they had something, and I really ought to have it too. I love soccer. I love it. Like it does a lot for my life. It makes me a happier person. Makes me a better father. All this stuff. But I don't tell other people, hey man, you really ought to play soccer too. Like figure it out yourself. Like I don't like to preach that. Like, I mean, I might mention it. Yeah, I'm playing soccer on Sunday, but even then, I'm really not into missionizing at all. And so one of the contradictions or paradoxes for me is, I definitely love being a humanist, and I was looking at the pamphlets out in the hallway, about humanism, and I started gathering a few, and I was like, oh man, I could bring this back to my class at Pitzer, and I could talk about this event, and I could show these pamphlets to the students, and I could be like, yeah, you should check this out. And then I stopped, and I was like, man, that's too freaky. That's too, what am I, a missionary here? Let them, I'm teaching and I kind of stopped myself. So what is hard for me is, with humanism, it's like, what I'm trying to say is, if we want to engage others and we want to be as self-identified, declared humanists, not just humanists by default, or this aspect or this aspect, I struggle with I don't want to do missionary work as a humanist. I want people to accept the ideals and values and principles of humanism, but I'm very uncomfortable saying, well, I'm a humanist, you should be too, you should wear this pin, and you should have this t-shirt, and you should go to this congregation. I'm happy if they do, but I struggle with that, so I think that's what limits humanism's reach, to put it, whereas religious people don't seem to have any problem with that. They love that, and they thrive on it, so they can point to, look what we're doing, and look what our group is doing, and look what our leaders are doing, and look what our prophets say. But I don't know, like I struggle with, as a humanist, wanting to replicate that, and since I don't want to replicate that, it does limit humanism's reach, humanism's community, humanism's ability to have good PR, and so I'm just curious how others struggle with that.
Well, just a couple of things. I'll respond to that, and then I'd like to backtrack a bit. I personally have no problem with folks proselytizing, whether they be theist or what have you. What happens within the context of personal and private engagements really isn't my business. Right. But I think one of the difficulties for humanists is that we tend to, my experience has been anyway, we tend to rip something away without replacing it. So we don't give people a soft place to land, as if telling them religion is crap is all they need to hear, right? They need a soft place to land. And that it seems to me that's particularly the case for some of the more battered populations, right? So for example, as an African American, to hear that the black church offers you nothing is a piss poor response to my need, right? Because at the very least, you can hide out there. And if the sermon is the price you pay for social connection, right, cultural inclusion, then you pay that price. There are a whole lot of folks doing this, yeah? But so to simply tell them what you're doing on Sunday at Mount Zion Bedside Baptist Church is irrelevant, whatever, right? A soft place to land. It seems to me that's a major issue. I'd like to backtrack a bit, and it seems to me that part of the difficulty with what it means to be a humanist is the counterpoint, right? That the counterpoint for us tends to be religion. But what is that, right? And it seems to me that for me, the more compelling point of opposition is theism as opposed to religion. I mean, religion is just a binding. I mean, you wrestle with this in the wonderful book we just finished reading. I know Bill wrestles with this, right? That religion, I think about religion as a kind of strategy, a technology, right? A device we use to try to come up with some sort of meaning in a context that doesn't seem very meaningful. It's a strategy, it's a tool, right? So to be in opposition to that doesn't make much sense to me, because I'm just as comfortable arguing that humanism or atheism can constitute a religious orientation, kind of based upon its effort to wrestle with meaning, whether it's achieved or not. But again, for me, the stronger point of opposition kind of revolves around humanism and theism.
All right, I am going to actually take this opportunity because this is a great segue. So we're talking about whether we're comfortable putting our values forward and talking about having something positive. And one of the advantages of humanism over simple non-belief is that it allows us to come together and have those intellectual conversations about what we want those values to be, how we want to articulate them as well. But what should a humanist value system look like?
Well, I'm going to do what we so often see in our presidential debates, which is I'm going to hear that question and I'm going to say something else. No, I'm just kidding. I promise I will circle back to that. The thing I just wanted to add, which I think is actually related, is when I got to Yale to start the Yale humanist community there, almost right away, I sat down for coffee with a really fabulous religion professor named Catherine Lofton at Yale. And her first question, like before I had even fully sat down, was, so tell me why humanism is not a religion. And right from the go, we had this really challenging conversation. And this is, I mean, as someone who comes out of, I studied religion at Augsburg College here in Minneapolis, and continued to study it in my graduate work at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. And this is something I've really wrestled with. And I think that, part of the allergy that some of us feel when we think about humanism as a religion has to do with a certain kind of religious expression that we've found challenging. And yet even now, as someone who's been doing humanist community organizing for the better part of a decade, I find myself at this point realizing that there are some real limitations to avoiding some of the things that I find myself sort of averse or allergic to. For example, the sort of being told what to think or do thing. I'm very averse to that. And yet, I think about when I was in high school, when I started high school, my mom, who is my favorite person in the world, told me that I needed, not that she really wanted me to, or that she thought that I should really strongly consider. She said I had to try out for a team sport. And just seeing me, you can probably tell that that was not something I was super thrilled about. I was also coming out of the closet at the same time, and I was the only person who was openly queer in my high school, so it felt risky and unsafe in certain ways. And I was really against this idea. And part of why I was against this idea is I had 3 siblings who were all very athletic, and I was the bookish one, and that was my identity. And so she was pushing me to really go far outside of my comfort zone. And I fought against her. I was really, really against it. But I lost that battle because it was my mom. And if you know my mom, there's no winning there. Well, ultimately I won, because what happened was I ended up trying out for cross country because I thought, first of all, it was like not a team sport really. And second of all, I was like, I'll just do it, and then whatever, I won't make the team. But I didn't realize in cross country, everyone makes the team. And so I ended up on the cross country team, but here's the thing. I ended up so I started out the absolute worst, and by the end I actually got most improved, and I found myself really enjoying this, and I did it again the next year, and I got most improved again the second year, in part because I didn't practice between the 2 years. But to this day, I run 3 to 4 days a week. I love it. It's a hugely important practice in my life, and it's something I would never have discovered if my mom had not challenged me and pushed me to look at something that I wouldn't otherwise and consider and try something that I wouldn't otherwise consider. And I'm rambling at this point, but there's a wonderful humanist at Harvard named Vanessa Zoltan. She's the assistant humanist chaplain at Harvard. She co-hosts a podcast called Harry Potter as a Sacred Text. I definitely recommend checking it out if you'd like. And she talks about her interest as a humanist in thinking of texts as sacred. And for her, it started with Jane Eyre. And what that means to her is that she decided to read Jane Eyre in a different way, not in this critical way, sort of looking for all the things to pick apart, but rather with something that she calls experimental certainty. She wanted to read it with the idea that it had something for her, something to offer her, something to teach her, and she was going to sort of put her faith in that and read it and see what came out of the text for her. And that to her felt like a very different approach. It felt like an opportunity for the text to impose something on her, even though she's very resistant to people imposing things on her, and I feel the same way. And so I think that there are opportunities, and so when you ask this question about what should humanism look like, or what should humanism actually mean in terms of our convictions, I think it's a conversation that a lot of us are very uncomfortable having. We don't want to say this is what humanism should mean or stand for, because we don't want to speak for or over other people. But I think we need to become a little bit more comfortable with the idea that humanism means certain things and doesn't mean other things, and that's a conversation that is critical to have for the future of humanism.
Yeah, I mean, I would venture to say that there's not a person in this room who doesn't have certain value commitments and who doesn't make certain normative judgments. We all think that some things are good and some things are bad, some things are right and some things are wrong. We need to own that. I happen to think that an atheist way of living is preferable to a theistic way of living. I'm not ashamed of that, and I'm not averse to making that case. Now, there are good ways of making that case, and there are bad ways of making that case. Again, I doubt that there's a single person in this room who likes to be imposed upon, but that's not the only way of making a case for your set of values and your set of normative commitments. So, I mean, I think we're all averse to the kinds of experiences you've had. I've had them as well, but that's not the only way to go about making the case for why certain value commitments are better than others and certain normative commitments are better than others. I mean, I think that's our obligation as atheists, as humanists, as naturalists.
I'm feeling like I'm Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole. Suddenly I had this idea that, from what you said, Tony, the overlapping circles of humanism, theism, and atheism. So I wouldn't put theism as the only other to my position. So there's this, I don't know how many of you have heard of Paulo Freire?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Brazilian educator who has worked with landless farmers in Brazil. And his basis is very humanist, and he claims that too. But it's based in liberation theology. So where secular humanism crosses over into institutional religious humanism and theism, for me is a mysterious area now, suddenly, that arises from your question. So I'd like you to think about that. Yes, I feel the same hesitation about saying what should something look like. I think that we arrive at that by consensus. But what I would like people to think about in terms of what our value systems look like is acknowledging the material consequences of our inequalities. We all do not walk into the room as equals. And to acknowledge how we function with each other on the basis of inequality. That is, as Audre Lorde put it, an African-American feminist, that we actually walk through our differences, not around them. And so I think what a value system would look like to regenerate what the wonderful value systems of justice, compassion, equity, respect, reason, and all of that is not to use all of those as weapons of mass intimidation, but to use them in terms of how we differently look at our material needs and how our values arise from our material inequalities, in the sense that a person who is struggling to survive and wondering where their next meal will come from considers justice or equity or compassion very differently from one who doesn't have to think about those things. How we acknowledge those inequalities within the room and amongst ourselves is the basis, I guess, some of the fertile ground from which our value systems can generate.
And this is a treat for me. I've not had an opportunity to talk to Sunita in, 13, 14 years? So I thank you for that. And I think you bring up a good point. I'd want to push a little bit. It seems to me there are ways in which Paulo Freire informs liberation theologies and ethics, but I see my read suggests clear distinctions, for example, between Paulo Freire and Gutierrez. And I think in terms of how issues of moral evil, human suffering, get resolved. For Gutierrez, he points to the book of Job, right? It isn't very satisfying, that there's something redemptive about it. But it seems to me for Paulo Freire, it's much more grounded in anthropology. It's much more grounded in human capacity to do good and ill. I kind of think about it this way, that Gutierrez kind of represents Augustine's perspective on people, right? We're just kind of screwed up, and we need some help getting this right. But Paulo Freire, more along the lines of Pelagius, we just follow a bad example. So let's correct the example and get to work.
Anybody else want to add anything on here? Are we comfortable generally with the content of the values that we have, even if we need to challenge ourselves in terms of how we think about them?
I'm not always so comfortable with the content of my own values, and this is why I'm drawn to community work, because I need a space where I can be held accountable to the things that I say are important to me, because left to my own devices, I often will not live those values out. I need people to help remind me, and I also want to help play that role for others. And so this comes back again to that. I think it's a fine line to walk. We certainly don't want our communities to feel unsafe. We don't want our communities to feel like spaces that are coercive. And I think the consensus model is at the heart of how we should arrive at the values that we're holding each other accountable to. But this is why I am a person who really benefits from and gets a lot of fulfillment out of being in community, because I feel that I am a better person when I am, and I'm living in a way that is more aligned with my highest values when I am in a space where I'm being held accountable to those. So, and a lot of that comes from, not just from being in community with like-minded others, but also being in communities that are engaging in hard conversations, that are bringing voices in that can teach and challenge me, help me see beyond the limitations of my own experiences and perspective. And I think that is, again, something that for humanism is very important moving forward.
Thank you for watching this program on the future of humanism, New Voices for the 21st Century. We'll continue with another at the same time next week. Thank you for tuning in.